Thank you. Please be seated. Well, thank you all so much for your patience, your love, and your support. Thank you for being here today. I know that coming into a funeral home for someone that we've cared for, it's one of the hardest things that we're ever asked to do. There are emotions here that are difficult to express. And Chris's death leaves us with feelings of grief and sadness. But underneath all that, we also have this sense of gratitude that you are able to be part of his life. And so even though it's hard to be here, you've come today because that's what we do when we care. Thank you for being here. Whether you're here in this room with us or you're watching online from anywhere in the world right now, I want you all to know that you're part of the healing process that's needed for each other right now. You see, Chris impacted our lives in the ways that only he could. In some way, Chris Steer touched your life. Whether he was Chris or Christopher or CJ or Mr. Steer, he made an indelible impression. And that story is not over today because it continues through each one of you. We've been told the greatest journeys we take in life are with those we love. So it's important that you're all here as this community of support where we can lift up his family and we can remind ourselves of the unique impact that Chris made on this world. So today is all about him. It's a gathering of family and friends where we remember his life, and we're not going to preach at you today because he wouldn't want me to do that. There can be lots of differing views in this room on what happens with faith and what happens after we die, and I'm not going to preach anything right now, but to say that whatever you believe, hold close to it right now and allow it to find some comfort in your heart. And so for theology, I'm simply going to use a few words from the Scottish poet named Robbie Burns. He kind of summed it all up in 2 lines when he said, if there's another world, he lives in bliss. And if there's none, he made the best of this. While we can't make everything better today, a few nice words is not going to end grief, but we can help each other tell Chris's life. It's a story that's amazing and complex and simple. And in this room, we're allowed to feel what we need to feel. If you can smile and laugh, that's okay here. He did that a lot. If tears need to fall, that's okay too. We can sit in silence or lean on one another. We know that it's okay to not be okay. The world seems like a very different place without his voice, because Chris was different than everyone else in your life. He didn't strive to be typical. He was exceptional in everything he did. He taught us important lessons in life. He was charming, he was tenacious, he was concerned for others. There was kindness, devotion, and yes, there was a competitive side as well. And honestly, he really didn't mind being the center of attention. So us talking about him is not a bad thing right now. He lived his life to the fullest, and he loved his people. You are his people. A friend of mine once said, surround yourself with the people who make you happy. Know that you are those people for him, and he can make you happy too. He loved you as only he could, and that was with all his heart. We've been told love, it always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres, and that love never fails. Love is not just the pretty feeling that comes around when everything's good. Sometimes it's hard work. And Chris was surrounded by love at every step of his life. Chris and Susan, they showed us that real love stories still exist in our world. He loved being a father to Jeffrey and Ian, and he loved that Lorna was brought into his world. He loved being a brother. In fact, he was the youngest of 5. He loved being an uncle, a relative, a neighbor. He loved his people at RCYC, and I can pick a few of you out. He loved everyone that was willing to debate him on pretty much any topic. But if you did, you better be prepared, because he knew his stuff. He loved listening to your story, and he can make you feel like the most important person in his world. He did life a lot different than most do, because he knew what he liked, and he did that a lot. It was Robert Frost who said, "I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." Well, he was never afraid to take his own path. Whatever he did it with all his heart. Boating, humor, even just being a gentleman. And he lived an interesting story that we're going to need the rest of our lives to tell. And he did it just by being himself. Now, a long time ago, a group of authors got together and they tried to summarize what they thought a life was worth living by. And they said that to laugh often and to love much, to win the respect of intelligent persons and the affection of children, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, and then to give of oneself, to leave this world a little better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to have played and laughed with enthusiasm and sung with exultation, and to know that even one life is breathed easier because you have lived, well, this is to have succeeded. It's going to take a lot to tell his story, and I'm very glad I have a little bit of help here today with that. We're going to hear from some very important people in his life, and in between them, we're going to hear some of the music from his life as well. And I hope you didn't come today expecting funeral church music, because that's not what he listened to. We're going to hear music that he found peaceful and calming, and music today that helps us remember him. Before we get into the music, I'm going to ask his son Ian and possibly his support crew to come up and share with us.
Oh, okay. Christopher's sons, this is my brother Jeffrey. I'm Christopher's son Ian. My brother would like to say a few words. Mr. Steer?
I just want to say the best thing my father ever did for me was to marry Susan. So I'm not feeling completely parentless. And next best thing he did was to adopt George. He also stuck me with, but I can, it's all right. And over to him.
Don't believe me. It's already 2 hard acts to follow. Christopher John Steer, what a life, what a legend, what a legacy. Dad's life, the impossible dream fulfilled, and against long odds, a kid from London, England, and parts not typically shown in the postcards. A kid bombed almost to death during World War II. And thank heaven Dad moved here to Canada, because the result, Christopher John Steer led an an immensely and intensely exciting, adventurous, and passionate life. And if I must try to sum Chris's life, big life, in a small number of words, I'd begin with 4. Work hard, play hard. Because fortune favors the prepared. Semper Paratus, always faithful. It's the Boy Scout motto, the Coast Guard motto, and words Dad lived by because it needs to be stressed. Chris Steer attained what he did in life in no small part by working his tail off. And yes, by day, Chris did insurance practice, but by night, he did insurance theory. He was super dad, and he earned his fellowship in the Insurance Institute of Canada, and presto, Dad became a rising star, a shooting star in the North American insurance industry. And indeed, as you all know, Dad went on to become a superstar. From a nobody to a somebody in apparently no time at all, an overnight success. But that is, of course, if you don't count all the years and decades of hard work, and of course, all the hard play to make all that hard work worthwhile. Because Chris was smart. He knew there is a balance to life, the universe, and everything. And that balance brings us to Susan. Because it is Susan who was, is now, and will always be the true love of Chris's life. It is Susan with whom, more than any other soul on earth, Chris both worked the hardest and played the hardest. And all our Steer family, Susan, my brother Jeffrey, me, all of us, all our friends, we know how much everyone loved Chris. Some for his gregarious spirit, some for his hilarious wit. But please also know that in return, Chris also loved all of you who loved him. In fact, many gathered with us today are kindred spirits, united by Chris, with Chris, for Chris, and we share in common the love of working hard, playing hard, and giving our all, and nothing less than our very, very best. And these souls, as a result, are good people, great people. So before departing here today, and departing forever physically from our dearly departed Chris, you deserve to take with you certain knowledge, and indeed, in my opinion, the key to the making of Chris. Christopher John Steer held a unified field theory about how to work hard and play hard in the best possible way. It has to be fun, son, Dad explained, because whether working or playing, if you are not having fun, you are not doing your best. And the best is the absolute minimum that any of us can afford to be giving. And I hope and pray my dad's words of his wisdom, will comfort you too in this difficult time. But at the very same time, I also appreciate capturing Chris in words is not easy. Simple cliches, work hard, play hard, above all, have fun, just simply of themselves cannot, will not, and do not do justice to the legend of Chris Steer. And let's face it, innumerable souls have come and gone and done all this and more, and still not succeeded. And let's also remember the actual X factor behind how and why some do and others do not achieve greatness is another cliche. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And everyone here, just by knowing Chris, is living, breathing proof of this vital life lesson. Now, on a personal note, I'd like to add how grateful I am to my dad for taking us with him, and by us I mean my brother Jeffrey and me, soon after he and our mom divorced. Jeffrey and I are both very grateful because Dad stayed present in our lives his entire life as a power, as a light, as a full-fledged force of nature to the end. And Susan also wanted us to remember Chris with greater than cliches. She reminds us that Dad was dedicated, driven, drawn to succeed. And the hard work I speak of, it almost always involved problem solving. And Chris's problem solving skills and drive, second to none. Dad was a true genius. He didn't mull problems. He stalked them, hunted them down, cornered and then tamed them until the beasts were his best friends and no longer our worst foes. Yes, indeed, Chris was much bigger than a single gemstone with multiple facets and views. Chris was limitless lenses, each with limitless views, and each focused to a depth and breadth few knew. Chris's superpower, imparting vast volumes of knowledge in the fewest words and simplest terms. Chris's most lovable trait, he loved his work. He loved his life. He loved his wife. He loved his clients, all of them as though they were members of his own family. And many of those clients are gathered with us here today as members of our family. Which leads us all right back to right here, right now. And the legacy of Chris Steer. Part of that legacy, albeit a smaller part, you're looking at. And I hope the club members will forgive me for wearing Dad's RCYC tie. Susan said I'd probably get away with it at least this once on account of spent a fair part of my inheritance in that club. But the biggest part of Dad's legacy, indeed the most important part, all kidding aside, it's you, ladies and gentlemen. It's each and every one of you, all of you gathered with us here today in loving memory of Chris. Many of you think of my dad as your dad, and I'm speaking of souls like Tom Rivers, Nick Vamard, Milan Kovacevic, John Golding, just a few among so many teammates, and other younger people, Aaron Barbarian, just some of the many sons and daughters of others that Chris loved as though his own. Chris's legacy, therefore, includes a hearty crew of very sharp, very smart young men and women. And speaking on my dad's behalf, if I may, I know he would want you to know how much he genuinely did love each and every one of you. He loved you precisely because of your fun-loving spirits at work and at play, and indeed you are the true kindred spirits of Chris Steer. And we know you loved Chris. We know so because we loved him too. How could you not? Yet, I cannot, would not, and should not ever pretend to be able to tell any of you fine souls what you should do or take away from here as a result of Chris's legacy. I can nevertheless most definitely share with you what I, for one, will most assuredly do. I'm going to pay it forward. I'm going to give back. I'm going to give my all to make our world a better place, not a bitter place. Generosity, gratitude, gratefulness, what my dad, Chris, did for all of us, we can now all do in return for him. We will make our world a better place, and we will work well and play well together, and we will, as a result, have even more fun by bringing together even more of the world than even Chris did. That is what Christopher John Steer would love the most. Thank you all, bless you all, and all our love to all of you for being there with Chris, for being here with Chris now, and for keeping Chris's joy of life, his joie de vivre, his esprit de corps, his je ne sais quoi in your hearts forever. We are very, very grateful. Thank you all. Thank you, Dad. Christopher John Steer.
Thank you so much, Ian and Jeffrey, for sharing your dad with us, for those poignant words, even when you had to slip into a foreign language at the end for a little bit there. You helped us remember him with a smile, and I think that's a wonderful thing today. And there's countless stories that need to be told. And in a few moments, Tom Rivers is going to come up and share with us. But before he does that, we're going to take a moment just to find our own place of peace. I think in the busyness of our lives right now, the most valuable thing we can give to one another is our time. And Chris would give you his time, and we're doing that for him right now. So let's just take a moment. We're going to listen to this song that helps us remember him a little bit and answer some of our own questions about what happens. And then when this song is over, Tom is going to come up and share with us. Let's listen together.
Where are you this moment? Only my dreams. You're missing, but you're always a heartbeat from me. I'm lost now without you. I don't know where you are. I keep watching, I keep hoping, but time keeps us apart. Is there a way I can find you? Is there a sign I should know? Is there a road I could follow?
Stairway to Heaven.
I'll play whatever you want me to play. Is Tom here? Thank you so much.
I almost didn't recognize the name Tom in Chris's world. He gave me the moniker Two-Tone. And I don't know where it originated from. I don't know what it meant. It was his secret. It's what he called me, and I gleefully accepted it. It was an honor, and no matter how many years passed, it was always Two-Tone, Two-Tone, Two-Tone.
Tan.
What's that?
You're tan.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Sorry.
I see a lot of fresh faces out in the audience here, and I imagine you're crew members of later editions of Maggie Kelly. I'm a ghost of crews of past. I sailed with Chris during the 1980s, the better part of a decade. And I look at these spit-polished faces and people out there, and we were anything but. We were nothing more than stray dogs looking for a home. And truly, we were a dysfunctional group. And like George the Beagle, Chris took us on board, and somehow he trained us, mastered us, made us feel welcomed, made us feel valued. It was a gift in no uncertain terms. He was always writing letters of apology to the RCYC Council, begging for forgiveness, but also telling them to go blow. But despite our behaviors, and they were bad at times, he never berated us. He never tried to change us. He celebrated the fact that we were different and that we were a ragtag group of individuals. I, for one, I met Chris in early 1980s, ironically through my father, who was a different character completely to Chris. My father bought Chris's first yacht, Hot Chocolate, which was a brown hull boat versus the subsequent green hulls. It was a CS-27, and I had a long history of sailing beforehand, but as a result of that relationship with my father, and through industry, they both were insurance industry executives, I was invited out to Maggie Kelly to race on the crew. And in those days, I was a steroid-using bodybuilder and came on board as winch beef. And it transpired over subsequent seasons that I became foredeck and a welcome member of the crew. The remarkable difference of CJ to my father was a pathological narcissist and very cruel. The abuse I faced under his daily practices left me hollow, empty, shallow, lost, hiding behind a perfect body and a fake smile. I didn't know who I was. And the invite onto Maggie Kelly and the introduction to Chris forever changed my life. I was always looking for a father or a mentor, and he arrived. Sorry, Susan,
Okay.
yeah,
I said it was okay.
yeah. I remember in March of '86, I was desperate. I was depressed, a major depression, and I was going to end my life. And it was March. It was cold. It was winter. And out of the blue, a call came from Chris and said, "Two-Tone, get your butt down to the yacht club. We're getting Maggie Kelly ready for the spring." And I dragged my butt down to the tender, and off to the island we went. In freezing cold temperatures, we began to prepare that boat for the spring season. And CJ was always the first, Maggie Kelly was always the first boat on the water in the spring, and the last out in the fall. Actually, it was early winter. Sometimes I remember we didn't get out until November, and we did a sail around the island, and the deck was covered in ice, and we'd end up back on the Toronto waterfront, and it would be a round of hot toddies for the crew. And but it was home for me. It was home for all of us, and truly we were. Susan can attest. We were a group of bad boys who needed a helping hand, and he was there for us. His accomplishments in sailing, we were sort of hit and miss during the season, so he'd be performers one race and bottom of the fleet the next. But in 1985, we won the Canadian Championships in something called the Grosh Cup. And it was probably one of the best level or match race racing on the lake. There would be over 30 CNC 34s out at the starting line. And we won that series, a series of 5 races, hands down. It all came together, and we just cleaned up the fleet. And I remember the celebrations afterwards, and Chris sitting back, and the beaming smile on his face, and the joy that he took in our accomplishment, and the success that finally came. And I've never felt so proud to be part of that crew and part of that man's life, and to have performed for him in that manner. We all know, I think most of you know, what a skilled yachtsman he was. Even in that CNC 34, his boat had a tiller. Everybody else had a wheel, but he had a tiller on a CNC 34. That takes Herculean strength, and he wasn't exactly a large man. And the fortitude and determination and grit and the sweat on that man during the course of the race was astounding. He made us all strive harder to be better at our jobs on that boat. He'd sometimes pulled right off the rail and into the cockpit, and he'd get back up cursing and swearing, but back on that helm, and away we went. We charged onward. That attitude also, I know his obituary mentioned the fact that he raced cars. And he started racing cars when most racing drivers are retiring. It just shows the fortitude and magnitude and determination of the man. And I went out to a couple of races to watch him, and I was shocked to see not only he started Formula V, then Formula 1600, and then Formula 2000, which are basically they're open wheel race cars that the 2000s look like smaller Formula 1 cars. And his cars were meticulously prepared and painted. And not only that, he would show up at the race course with a transport rig painted the same color as the car, and with client-supplied crew mechanics to keep the cars running. And he was a rock star, and whatever he did, and yet a humble rock star. I think his racing career only ended at the age of 68 because he had a bad accident. He hit a tire wall and ended up upside down and significantly concussed. Otherwise, he'd probably still be racing up until his 91st year. I made notes, and I don't know why I made notes. I don't even know where I am. I too became an insurance industry executive, and I worked for the big corporations, the big corporate entities, and I always remember the industry knew that I crewed and raced for Chris Steer because he was so well known, and the clients that he had were rather prestigious to the large brokers because of the size and the complexity and the premiums involved. And they would also come to me and say, "Okay, we've got to go after this Chris Steer account. We have to go after this business." And I would say, "There's no point." I said, "There's nobody that has relationships with clients like this man does." And it was true. Chris never lost his business. He retained his clients, the business grew, and the big brokers who used to puff their chests and bang their chests, they walked away realizing that it was futile, and it was. Chris also guided me in terms of being a corporate guy. I was extremely unhappy because I had entrepreneurial roots as well, and he would tell me, don't work and make money for somebody else, do it on your own. And I eventually did set up my own companies in Vancouver and Calgary, and forever grateful for that encouragement, that mentorship that had me strive and reach forward to reach my own full potential and become the man that I became. The child hiding behind the facade was finally gone, and I realized my true value, my true worth, my purpose in life. There's a quote by an author by the name of Richard Bach, who wrote A Bridge Across Forever, which was a big selling book back in the 1980s. And he wrote, the bond that creates one's true family is not necessarily of blood, but rather joy and respect in each other's lives. And that is what Chris represented for me and what he created for me and so many others. And I think most of you can attest to that, how he made you feel welcomed. And it wasn't so much that he wasn't a mentor that gave advice or criticized or found solutions for you. He was just present to listen. And that was his gift. When you were in his company, you had his attention. His mind wasn't drifting. He looked you in the eyes and he listened to you, and you knew that you had an interested audience, somebody who cared for you. So I make these comments, but because of being in the insurance industry and the sailing industry, I reached out to individuals within both communities to ask them about, if you could make a comment about CJ in a sentence or two, could you help me out? And they did as such, and I don't have that list of comments. I left it behind in the car. But I can somewhere. Let's see here. There's one of the ones where the last true gentleman on the Great Lakes, and how true that was. I always remember that after each race or regatta, the crew, he always spoiled us. He'd take us to a dinner. He'd pick up the tab and the bill, and Susan was always included. Susan would arrive at the end of the day of the race and would join our table. And one thing that he taught me, and I've subsequently passed on to my sons, was when a woman arrives at a table, you stand up and you take her chair and you sit her down. And if she ever, for whatever reason, gets up to leave again, you stand again. And he taught all of us that lesson on not only that, but on being gentlemen. His love for people was only matched, as Jeffrey had mentioned about George the Beagle, was his affection for animals. And he brought George the Beagle out racing once and only once. But the insurance industry people got back to me, and they remembered at a time in the 80s when it wasn't the cool thing to do, he would visit corporate insurance offices with George the Beagle in tow. And also there was an announcement in the Globe and Mail financial business section concerning announcements and promotions of people within various industries. There was George the Beagle. A photograph of George the Beagle promoted to the title of Chief Executive Dog. His claim to fame was no crumb ever reached the floor. And he was interviewed by various networks, I think even the CBC. The response was amazing. Like, who is this man and who is this dog? And his humor was dry, that British dry wit. He could come up with a humorous comment using 3 words maximum, where the rest of us would take a paragraph. And my God, he was loved and respected by all of us. To Susan, thank you for sharing CJ with all of us. I wouldn't be here today without the gift of his presence you provided and allowed him, without criticism, to spend those hours and hours on that boat. Or taking us out for dinners or drinks just to see how we were doing. And to Ian and Jeffrey, I know what you sacrificed with granting your father to spend so much time with all of us. But it is noted and it is not forgotten.
It was a good move.
It was very generous of you. And when I was asking others for comments about CJ, I thought to myself, well, what is your comment about CJ? And my comment was immediately came floating up and obvious when I said, the world was a safer place when you walked amongst us. So we all make commitments in these times of emotion. But for me, I'm a man of heart today and a man of truth. And I've changed because of Chris being a big part of that change. And I can say with the greatest of commitment, I shall carry his legacy forward in my interactions with others day in and day out. It won't be forgotten when I get out of this room. So, as you mentioned, if we all might do the same thing as we remind ourselves in times of duress, times of frustration, to practice kindness to others who might frustrate us, because the impact on them could have the same effect as Chris's kindness impacted and saved my life. And I am so grateful and so sad by his passing, and I thank you all for listening.
Thank you for your openness and your honesty in sharing the depth of the impact that Chris made on lives. And I think for all of us men here, we've learned some valuable lessons today on how to be a gentleman through Chris's life. Some of the stories we could share by words, some of them just fall short. So we're going to take a moment and we're going to look through a few pictures that's going to help share his story. I'll turn your attention to the screens.
drift by my window. The falling leaves of red and gold. I see your lips, the summer kisses, the sunburned hands I used to hold. Since you went away, the days grow long, and soon I'll hear old winter's song. But I miss you most of all, my darling. When autumn leaves start to fall, since you went away, the days grow long, and soon I'll hear old winter's song. But I miss you most of all, my darling. When autumn leaves start to fall, I miss you most of all, my darling. When autumn leaves start to fall.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Terry Wills. I've known Chris for close to 50 years, and we were a client of Christer Insurance for a long time. I'll tell you about that story. Tom, I have to say that I really enjoyed your eulogy, but I would really rather have spoken first. Because you're going to see quite a few similar themes to what Tom shared. But Susan, Ian, and Jeffrey, thank you for the honor of speaking at your dad's and your husband's funeral. A man that I loved, I respected, and a man that I looked up to. Today is a day about remembering Chris and celebrating Chris's life. But Susan, I do want to mention to you my respect for you, as you have loved and cared for Chris right to the end. During the dating years, I understand you played that hard-to-get card and made him wait for 4 years. However, you were equally tenacious as you advocated for Chris and his health care these last 4 years and loved him to the end. You made those wedding vows to love and to cherish until death do us part. Reality. Thank you for example. And I know that he loved and admired you. I saw Chris and Susan lots together at conventions and industry conferences over the years. Heather and I often had lunches and sat with them at conventions. And Tom, as you mentioned, Chris is the only guy that I have ever seen that would stand when Susan left the table, and he would stand and hold her chair when she returned from the table. You're always a couple. You did life together. During the time that we were with Chris Steer, I think I counted up, you made 25 trips to the little town of Smith Falls together for the annual business insurance review, and we looked forward to those times. And we always enjoyed a lunch or dinner, and it was times that we looked forward to. I want to share two characteristics of my friend Chris that had a significant impact on my life. And they're common themes. Chris as a mentor and Chris as a gentleman. Growing up in a family moving business, I knew of Chris when I was probably 20 years old. He was always at the United Van Lines conventions and meetings, and Chris was looked up to as kind of the guru in the industry in terms of his experience and his knowledge of insurance. Chris had talked to my dad about becoming a client of Chris Steer, but being a small company from a little town with Smith Falls and having a local insurance adjuster down the street, we opted to go with the little insurance adjuster down the street. And that worked out fine and good until we had a warehouse fire, March 19th, 1984, 9 o'clock in the morning. Well, about 3 o'clock that day, after the insurance adjuster had visited me, I came to realize that we had no contents coverage. We had coverage on the building, coverage on the fleet, but we had no content coverage. And the warehouse and the contents were a total loss. We were in a really bad spot. I called Chuck Martin, another one of my mentors, and asked him for his advice. And his advice was pretty short. You better talk to Chris Steer. So I called Chris, and we weren't even a client at that time. And he helped me understand from an insurance standpoint the gaps we had in our coverage, the gravity of our position, and the potential outcomes. He schooled me on errors and omissions, on what to say and what not to say, and the litigation process that would surely follow after the smoke cleared. And Chris said, the first thing you do after you get off the phone with me is call Eric Williams in Ottawa. He's the best insurance lawyer. You want to get him working for you and not your customers have him working against you. Our call lasted an hour, and I picked up the phone. It was 6 o'clock on March 19th, 6 o'clock at night. That was before cell phones. I called the number that Chris had given me, and it was a large law office in Ottawa, and Eric Williams answered the call. And I was so thankful. Over the next 7 years of litigation, Chris and Eric worked tirelessly on our behalf, and they actually saved our business. Our business would not be here today had it not been for Chris Steer. I loved getting Chris's letters. That was long before emails. That's when he would type them out on the old underwriter. 2 or 3 pages, single-spaced, lots of graphic language, lots of colorful, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just that he could paint a word picture by words. And he would share his recommendations and answer my questions on, Chris, what do we do now? We became a client of Chris Steer Insurance on March 20, 1984, the next day after our fire, and we're still with the firm today. Chris was one of those men in my life that always added value every time that I was with him. Chris was a leader, a visionary, and he was also a student of learning. Every meeting with Chris, I would learn something from him, something about insurance or something new about business or the world or just about life in general. And as has been mentioned by Tom, Chris had a way of interacting that made me feel that I was just a young guy that didn't know anything, but that I was appreciated, and he wanted to spend time with me. And it was a wonderful gift that Chris had. However, much as he was kind and gentle, Chris was always one step ahead of me and had a very sharp wit and a very quick mind. I'm forever grateful for Chris and his mentorship to me. Chris, as a gentleman. There's some folks that go through their whole life and you never hear anything bad about them. Like you just don't hear. You walk into the room and people are not whispering and talking in the corners. Like I just never heard anyone say anything bad about Chris. He was one of those few people in my life that I've never heard anything bad about. Chris always treated people with respect. He treated people in a way that you would want to be treated yourself. And when I think of Chris, as Tom had mentioned, that word gentleman comes to mind. Chris and Susan were generous and kind. For probably over 15 years, Susan, you gave us the timeshare up in Halliburton at Williams Landing during the winter months, and we enjoyed that. Our family got to enjoy it. And all those who knew Chris will remember his smile and that twinkle in his eye. I had a chance to spend some time with Chris about a month ago. He was in the hospital, but he was really clear. We had 2 beautiful hours of reminiscing and sharing stories from the past 50 years. I was so thankful for that visit. We also talked a bit about the Christian faith and the promise of heaven. I believe Chris is now at peace in heaven because of his confession of faith in Jesus, who loved him and died for him. Let me close with a Bible verse and a poem that I think of when I think of Chris. The Bible verse goes like this: "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." And the poem that I think of when I think of Chris is this: "It isn't the size of your house as such that matters so much at all. It's the gentle hand and its loving touch that makes it great or small. The friends that come and the hour they go, when they from your house depart, will judge you not by the style you show, but rather by the size of your heart. It isn't the size of your head so much, and it isn't the wealth that you've found. What will make you happy is how you touch the other lives around. For making money is not so hard, and to live life well, it's an art. How people love you and how they regard is all in the size of your heart." And that's how I would like to remember Chris. The next song is a theme from Chariots of Fire. Susan and Chris were watching this movie when they were dating, and Susan saw the enthusiasm as Chris watched the runners on the beach. When she saw the energy in Chris and the passion for his life, she knew she was in love with him. And the rest is history, and hence the great memories that are associated with this next song.
Clearly, Chris's life was about adventures, experiences, but it was also about relationships. You see, family came to him not just by birth, but by choice and by love. And there's a lot of family that he inherited with Susan as well. And so I'm going to ask her nephew, Chris Weber, to come up and share with us now.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I had the fortune to meet Chris in the 1980s when I was a pimply teenager. And for the most part, I didn't spend a lot of time with him and my own concerns. But when Chris and Susan were married in 1987, I remember that being probably one of the funnest weddings I ever went to. It was at the RCYC, and the food was fantastic. So I really enjoyed that, but I didn't get to spend much time with him until 1994, when, out of the blue, like one of those strays, he asked me to crew on Maggie Kelly. And this was in the CNC 34 days. And I wasn't winch beef by any stretch of the imagination, but I guess he just needed another 175 pounds of ballast. So he took me on, despite the fact that I didn't know anything at all about sailing. And I remember two distinct occasions during that season that really embody sort of who Chris was. And I made a lot of mistakes on that boat. Because it was my first season, I sat on a lot of cleats. But one of the things I did, I was standing in the cockpit just as we were tacking over, which is not a place to be standing, and the boom came swinging around and stopped just an inch before it would have caved me in. And I was facing Chris, and he got that look on his face, which wasn't horror, wasn't concern, it was more, well, what did we learn? And I'm glad I don't have to tell Susan her favorite nephew has a big dent in his head. And the second time was right before a race. We were heading out to the starting line, and one of the women was winching and lost track of the winch handle, and out it went, sailing into the ocean, glinting, or into this lake, glinting. And Chris looked back, and then he looked at her, and then he looked and went, "You owe me a winch handle." And that was the last thing he said about it. He was just unflappable. It didn't matter what you were doing. He was just going to take it all in stride. Some years later, when I was looking for a grown-up job after the pimply teenage years, Chris and Susan took a really big chance on me and recommended me to an insurance company with whom they had just signed to do a lot of business. And I imagine the conversation went something along the lines of, here's all of this revenue, and my bartender nephew also needs a job. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then Chris took me out and bought me a couple of new suits and got me presentable. And I spent some time in the insurance industry, and then after some seasoning, I joined their firm. And Chris was always generous with the advice and the expertise, and had no end of patience. Explaining concepts in a way that, made them make sense. And I think anybody who's read anything of his knows that he really had a way with the written word. And some people have said he was brief, but there were times when Chris would use 3 words where one might do, when he really wanted to nail a concept down. And Tom mentioned that article in the Financial Post or the Globe and Mail with George the Beagle being named chief executive dog. You couldn't miss Chris's style, whether he was writing for pleasure or whether he was writing for business. And I still have to this day some things he's written about insurance from 20 years ago that I still refer to when I need to just get something just right. I always refer back to his writing. And he used that same style when he would negotiate with insurance companies. He would bring them around to his way of thinking, just through the power of the way he wrote, and the way he walked them through his thought process. And if they were still being obstinate about it, well, that's where Susan came in. They used the velvet glove and the iron fist approach. And I think that's really what made them such a formidable team and was a big key to the success of the firm. Chris built his firm, but he and Susan really turned it into a successful business together. Chris was a master of the written word, but he didn't enjoy the writing per se. Chris and technology kind of had an uneasy partnership. He'd mostly rely on others when it came to computer stuff. And I can remember a few times where he would come to me and say he needed a report or he needed something done on a spreadsheet to bring to an insurance company. And I would say, okay, and I would sit down, and after about 10 minutes of figuring out how I was going to be putting it together, he would stick his head out of the office and ask me if it was done yet. And I would give him a look, and he would say, well, don't you just have to press a button? And I would say, yes, quite a few of them in a very specific order. And Chris would do that thing. He would go, that hand gesture that he would do. Off you go then. And he'd trust me to do what needed to be done. He understood what he didn't understand. He knew. And he found cell phones particularly frustrating. I know for a fact that the number of cell phones in Lake Ontario is greater than the number of people who have dropped cell phones in Lake Ontario, because at last count, I knew he'd plunked 3 of them. Now, some of the Maggie Kelly crew can probably give me an updated number on that, but I know it's at least 3. As you all know, Chris was just generous to a fault. And we had a sort of a tacit agreement in the office that you'd get phone calls from telemarketers and we would keep them away from Chris because you knew what was going to happen. Jeffrey had a sixth sense when people would call in and they would say, may I speak to Chris Steer, please? He knew what they were after. No, I'm sorry, he's not here. He'll call you back. That's fine. I do remember one person getting through and me coming in on the tail end of that conversation with him promising to send them money. But I know that company was on the up and up, so that was okay. And Chris also had a number of homeless people on his roster, and he would be forever slipping them cash whenever we would walk by them. And his generosity extended to us, the Weber family, when he joined us, and he really got to know and love our family. He loved my grandfather and my grandmother, and when my grandfather was getting older, he would, his shaving wouldn't be so accurate and, might need a haircut, and Chris would come over and he'd take him to the barber in Dundas and get him all done up proper so he looked good for Maureen. And he felt that he hadn't really connected well with my Uncle John, who passed away some 20 years ago. And he always kind of felt bad about that. And when John passed, Chris wrote just a beautiful eulogy for him. And it's not, something to be shared here, but it's something that my family really treasures. And like Tom said, Chris wasn't a big guy. He didn't take up a lot of room in the world. He was a man of small gestures that had a big impact. It was something I would see all the time in the office with him and Susan. It was hand-holding, and he always had a pet name for her, and it was they were a team together, but more than that, they loved each other. And you could tell it was the office. It wasn't just a place of business, it was a home for them. And as much as he taught me about insurance, and he may have taught other people about sailing or whatever other topic, I think that's what I'll remember is those little gestures that he made that had such a big impact on other people. And I miss him.
I hope you all realize how fortunate you are to have been part of his journey through this world. And because of you, Chris's story is not over today. It's always going to be part of who you are. It's okay to have times when you miss him. He was a good man who enjoyed life, had a lot of fun along the way. He got through some tough times too. You can be sad because you want him here, but you don't need to be sad for him. He's now free from the pain he was feeling, and his memory is always going to be part of who you are. We've heard a lot of his ability with words, and we've had some good authors here today. We've had little Ralph Waldo Emerson and Robert Frost. Well, there's another side too. And there's a few words that Hunter S. Thompson wrote that I think kind of fit in here as well. He said, "Life should not be the journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and a well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a big cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, 'Wow, what a ride.'" Chris had an incredible ride through this world. And when we leave this place, we have this incredible privilege and responsibility of remembering that and sharing that story with others. And as we talk about the best of him, you're going to see people smile. And you'll know then that he's touched someone's heart, just as he's done countless times before. So don't ever be afraid to say his name, because every time you do, you'll find healing. And so we're going to conclude our service here, because he probably feels I've spoken long enough. There's a lot of food next door. There's a lot of stories, memories. There's pictures, and there's a chance to lift one another up. And you might find that as you do so, your own pain becomes a little bit lighter and a little bit easier to bear. And so I'd ask, if you're able, would you please stand with me? And we're going to be leading the family as we make our way to the front and to your right as we go across the hall. Take some time with them and help each other to remember him. Thank you so much for being here and for being part of the healing process for one another.